The subject is synchronicity and karma, focusing heavily on the theory of synchronicity as developed by Carl Gustav Jung, which is quite a fascinating subject in itself to look at in a part of the body of work that Jung produced over his career. It's one of the more perhaps obscure elements, less referenced of his body of work. Mostly we hear about, the collective unconscious, archetypes, his work on dreams. Of course, we hear a lot about his relationship with Sigmund Freud. But while there are many fascinating areas that we could look into with Jung, this was a particular area that I thought was interesting to understand, explore a little bit, and to draw some comparisons with the Eastern concept of karma. Why are these ideas interesting? Well, beyond interesting, I suppose they're useful because they can help us in observing ourselves to find ways to extract meaning from what's happening to us in life, understanding the purpose and meaning behind things that happen. From a philosophical perspective, certainly something that humanity has always strived to do, and perhaps even more so now in these very uncertain times, that we can find ways to discern meaning from the things that are happening around us. Without getting into perhaps the trap of seeking for significance in every little thing that happens and trying to draw parallels out of coincidences where it's not really necessary, what these theories put forward is a way of going beyond the purely rational experience of things and exploring perhaps a slightly more intuitive way of relating to life. Now, in Jung's theory of synchronicity, at least in the areas that I've researched so far, I haven't come across any direct reference to karma. So it's not quite a parallel that he seemed to draw. But we'll see, at least I'll try to create a bridge to show the similarities between them. Karma in itself, if we look at it very simplistically, it's commonly understood as cause and effect, action, reaction, which is correct. But beyond the simple understanding of it, there's a tremendous complexity to the idea of karma, which I'll try to illustrate so that we can see how it relates to the idea of synchronicity. With synchronicity, what Jung is explaining is that there is a way of understanding meaning, that there's a significance to what happens, even if there's no apparent link of cause and effect. Even if we can't understand exactly why something is happening, we can derive a certain meaning from it. And when we look at karma in more detail, we can see that there is an incredible complexity in the pattern of cause and effect that's at play in life. I think we all know, at least intellectually, that life is not straightforward. Life is very complicated. But it seems that in practice, we have some difficulty accepting or integrating that complexity in our daily lives. So my objective here is that we can start to understand some insights into this idea of complexity, synchronicity, and karma to help us in a practical way understand how we can perceive the underlying meaning behind seemingly unrelated events. So with the man himself, Carl Gustav Jung, though we don't really have time for an extensive biographical introduction, I think the theory of synchronicity itself gives us a certain insight into the man and his way of working, because it was very much something that was pioneered by Jung. And he was a pioneer and an adventurer in the field of psychoanalysis and psychology. So it's very characteristic of the way that he worked. There were many areas of psychology, there are many areas of psychology today that we kind of take for granted. They're quite commonplace, even if we don't understand them in great detail. But things like the unconscious, the collective unconscious, archetypes and the work and dreams, all of these things that we somewhat take for granted today, they were relatively unheard of in the early part of the 20th century. So it was a tremendous amount of work from the likes of Jung and Freud and others that brought about these ideas in a new way for the time that they lived in. Now, it's not to say that Jung or really others in that field invented anything. Rather than inventing, people in that field, they were rediscovering a lot of things that had already existed in antiquity. Theories, principles of life that give insights into the human condition and psyche, but which had largely been lost in the West, at least. So Jung and others did incredible work in rediscovering and representing these ideas for the modern era. And so in many ways, even then, a lot of this stuff was quite controversial. It was very different. It was very new. Depth psychology, psychoanalysis, they were presenting a way of looking at the human being, a non-materialistic vision of the human being based on an inner perception, which was quite revolutionary at the time. And even then, within that already somewhat controversial discipline, Jung was also controversial, even within the psychoanalytic community. Because the theories that he had, the ideas that he had, even went against or in contradiction in some cases to what was developing in the status quo of psychology and psychoanalysis at that time. If you do look into Jung's life in any detail, and I can certainly recommend Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is his kind of semi-autobiographical book that he wrote and was written about him, gives a good insight into his life and his work, and how he even experimented a lot in a way on himself, in that his theories, his ideas, you know, he didn't treat them lightly. He lived them, and he went inside himself to test his theories, to make sure they were valid, so that, you know, he had an authenticity in what he was saying because he lived it. And it helped him then to help others. But so even with that and the success, the relative success that he had at the time, there was still a lot of resistance from his peers. He had a lot of rejection, a lot of criticism, but he had a certain level of courage, perhaps integrity, that he was able to maintain his course and keep persevering with his ideas, so that he could eventually create his own theory or psychology, analytical psychology it's called, which he would be able then to implement and use in his practice. The criticism that was leveled at him often was that his methods weren't valid, weren't scientific enough. But we'll see some of the examples of that, and while, you know, we can understand where those criticisms come from, he did have a very scientific mind. He was very scientific in his approach, very rigorous in his experimentation, very thorough in his writing and his analysis. But he felt that, you know, the purely empirical scientific method alone was too limited when it comes to the psyche, because the psyche is not empirical. There is an element there that is immaterial, that is metaphysical. So there has to be an intuitive dimension to psychology for it to be able to open up all of the possibilities of the human being. So to go beyond what was being practiced as the conventional wisdom of the time in terms of psychoanalysis, he would work in areas that would have been considered paranormal, or today what's referred to even as pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is, I suppose it's generally a pejorative term. It's not usually used as a positive thing, but we can understand the idea of pseudoscience simply as an area of science that cannot be scientifically verified or denied. So the assertion being that you can't really conduct satisfactory, suitable scientific experimentation in these areas. But that didn't really stop Jung. He did it anyway. And he experimented in those areas to create his theories across different fields like telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, working with a lot of other people at the time in those same fields who were trying to understand what were the capabilities, the capacities of the human psyche. So then we come to one of the most inspiring moments in Jung's career early on. He was already quickly quite a prominent member of the psychoanalytic and scientific community of the time. And he had over to his house several times for dinner a young Albert Einstein, as one does. You have a dinner party, you invite Einstein. And over dinner, over dessert and coffee, they talked about their different ideas. Einstein shared with him one evening the theory of relativity. And this planted a seed in the very curious mind of Jung as he started to think about this realm of time and space and the relativity of them. And thinking that this relativity of time, as applied to the psyche, could help us to understand psychological phenomena. And developing that, he developed what would become the theory of an acausal connecting principle, which is what would become known as synchronicity. So he's talking about an acausal connecting principle, meaning that acausal, without cause, it's not related to causality, or at least it's an event that has no apparent cause. So something that doesn't appear to be connected with any visible link of cause and effect, yet which contains some kind of significant meaning. This is what he termed synchronicity, which he later went to kind of simplify by referring to meaningful coincidences. So that's a useful way to kind of give us an initial summary of the idea of what we're talking about. That Jung was suggesting we are connected. Everything in life is connected, if not by cause and effect, then at least by meaning. And so that's the basis then from which he started to develop and explain this idea of synchronicity. Okay, so to understand this theory a little bit better, we're going to look at, just briefly, a couple of supporting ideas that he developed, which helped him to support and lead on this idea of synchronicity. The two supporting ideas that he worked on are divination and astrology. These would both be examples of esoteric or occult sciences that he looked into that would have been seen as unscientific. Divination is what? It's referring to seeking knowledge or answers through interpreting signs and symbols, generally through occult means. Now, I'm saying occult here, and that's a word that doesn't always have a favorable association, but occult sometimes I think is misinterpreted as simply black magic or satanic stuff. And certainly Jung, his reputation was tarnished sometimes by being associated with these things because they weren't considered scientific. But the word occult is actually quite interesting, coming from the Latin occulte, meaning hidden. So occult or esoteric are referring to types of knowledge that are very ancient, hidden within, that have to be discovered. Not simply typical scientific methods, but something that helps to connect with the hidden part of life. So in practicing divination, what was Jung's approach was working with a text known as the I Ching, which was an ancient Chinese text, also called the Book of Changes. And the I Ching is roughly estimated to be about 3,000 years old. And its historical purpose was for exactly that, for divination, to determine and interpret events. sometimes being used as a means of cosmological determination of events. So trying to read meaning in things through interpretations in the text. How did that work? The process was practicing using the text, which contained various instructions, if you like, kind of aphorisms, and in league with the text, using a sequence of numbers or patterns, which would be randomly generated, so that you end up with a section or a text from the book, which would then, that passage of text would then perhaps contain some kind of meaning. So the traditional ways of doing that, which Jung practiced, were either through working with a collection of small twigs, kind of branches called yarrow stalks, or through flipping a coin, successfully flipping a coin until you generate a random sequence. That number then gives you a passage in the text. You read the passage, and that perhaps then will have some kind of meaning for you. So he was very interested in this process and the results that he found in randomly consulting the I Ching. He was able to find meaning in the passages that he arrived at for himself, and eventually he expanded that to practice with his patients, so that he could see in many cases there was something significant that was being highlighted through the passages of the text. So there's an example of that from one of the writings that he had on synchronicity. And I'm just going to read this here. It says, Jung was fascinated by the results he obtained from I Ching readings. He found many meaningful connections with his own thought processes, which he could not explain to himself. He began to use the I Ching with his patients too, and found that a significant number of the answers given were relevant to the patient's problems. For example, a young client was wondering whether he should marry a certain girl. When the I Ching was consulted, it gave the reply, "The maiden is powerful. One should not marry such a maiden." The girl seemed suitable, but deep down the young man was afraid that she would soon become like his dominating mother. So that's one example, of which Jung recorded many, where even through randomizing the sequence that led to a passage of the text, the content in that passage would have relevance for the patient. Here highlighting an unconscious concern that the man had of this girl's similarity to his mother. These examples in his practice furthered his sense that there was an underlying significance and meaning that connected things in life. And he viewed it then as a means of helping us to go beyond the blockages of the ego and to connect more with our own intuition in how we perceive the events and circumstances of life. So if everything is connected, then as Jung was considering increasingly likely to be the case, how can we observe that? How can we study it? How can we relate it to our own psychic states? For this, he turned to astrology to provide a lot of keys and insights to help. He saw already the idea of cosmological astrology tied in with a lot of his own understandings and ideas about archetypes, about the collective unconscious, about psychic energy. And so he felt that if there is this kind of connective tissue of meaning that links everything together, it could be fascinating and possibly useful to understand the relationship that the heavenly bodies and their movements through the solar system have in how they relate to and impact that psychic energy. So he started conducting experiments, researching through astrology, trying to understand how he could discern something clearly to help support his theory, these observable patterns that could be discerned. And so he started a great work in comparing and contrasting people's astrological birth charts. Probably the most substantial research that he did was into comparing the birth charts of married couples. The hypothesis being that, beyond all of the circumstances, excuse me, that bring people together, if two people are able to forge this kind of bond and relationship in a marriage, perhaps there is a more significant meaning beyond just the circumstances. Working with a few others in this field, he conducted a lot of experiments, found a lot of interesting overlaps and relationships. Nothing that he ultimately felt was conclusive, so it didn't produce any final theories or aspects that he added into his work. But one of the interesting outcomes of the experiment was that the results varied depending on who was conducting the experiment. So he was discovering that the subjective expectations of the observer was being mirrored somehow in the results. And obviously we know a little bit confirmation bias is something that they talk about already in the scientific community, but increasingly now it seems to be something that string theory is starting to illustrate, that we're kind of only really discovering the extent of it now, that the observer can affect the results of what they're observing simply through the act of observation. So all of this work in astrology that he was doing, again, would have been considered a pseudoscience, not scientifically valid. It would have been viewed poorly by his contemporaries. Freud, while they were working together, suggested that he should veer away from that kind of work so that he could be taken seriously. But Jung continued, feeling strongly that it was important work. After they parted ways, their professional and personal lives diverged from their very public falling out. Then Jung was more openly criticized by Freud and others, calling into question his research methods. But despite all of the resistance and the criticism, he continued and continued to develop the theories until in 1952, he published the now famous paper, Synchronicity and A-Causal Connecting Principle. So as it suggests, we're talking about something synchronistic, something related to simultaneity. Things are happening simultaneously. He's describing, as I mentioned, a meaningful coincidence, two or more events for which something other than the probability of chance is involved. Because if we have a coincidence, something happens and it's random, but it's coincidental, it's easy to dismiss that as just something that happens by chance. But when the coincidences start to pile up, particularly if they're obscure in nature or can be perceived with some kind of symbolic content, the more of these coincidences there are, then the less likely it is that it's simply down to chance. He has an example, again, from his own writing on this, which I have here. And he says, on April 1st, 1949, so April Fool's Day, but we won't read too much into that, I made a note in the morning of an inscription containing a figure that was half man and half fish. Then there was fish for lunch. Somebody mentioned the custom of making an April fish of someone. It's kind of a Swiss April Fool. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for months, showed me some impressive pictures of fish. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with sea monsters and fish in it. The next morning, I saw a former patient who was visiting me for the first time in 10 years. She had dreamed of a large fish the night before. A few months later, when I was using this series of events for a larger work and had just finished writing it down, I walked over to a spot by the lake in front of the house where I had already been several times that morning. This time, a fish, a foot long, lay on the sea wall. Since no one else was present, I have no idea how the fish could have got there. Again, an interesting example from his own experience, something that shows an apparently random and uncoordinated series of events that at the same time are linked by some symbol or some kind of meaning, even months apart. And the hypothesis really for Jung is that when these things start to stack up, the likelihood of it being purely down to chance becomes more and more remote. What he's presenting with this idea really is that there's a way of understanding events even if we can't explain them. Sometimes our rational preoccupation is trying to explain everything. And if we can't explain it, then we don't understand it, and we perhaps even exclude it from our thought process. But to open ourselves up beyond the purely rational, we can understand things even if we can't explain them. It's a different perspective because it means that we don't necessarily have all the answers, but that doesn't mean that we have to dismiss everything that happens. Examples of this, he refers to things like telepathy, clairvoyance, even déjà vu. He describes them as not scientific concepts which could be taken as statements of principle, for no one has yet succeeded in constructing a causal bridge between the elements, making up a meaningful coincidence. So we don't have yet a way of linking by cause and effect these meaningful coincidences. So we can't take them as statements of principle, but we can understand and derive meaning from them, even if we can't explain exactly why it's happening. So these things that happen to us, these kind of spooky moments or uncanny coincidences, he's suggesting that they reflect something from inside us. They're connecting perhaps with the unconscious, with the archetypal. They're presenting something of meaning which we can investigate, we can reflect on, as opposed to simply dismissing it because it's a coincidence. Another prime example from his own practice of how he used this, and again, using it to try and puncture the rationality of the ego, which can often only see things black and white. It needs to see the cause and the effect to understand things. He used synchronicity to help his patients get beyond that limited vision in order to open up their own awareness of themselves. So that example here, he says, my example concerns a young woman patient who, in spite of efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose, namely a highly polished rationalism. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had had an impressive dream the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned round and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside, in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabæid beetle, whose gold-green color was most nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. So again, it's an example from his own practice of how he could use synchronistic events to help people to go beyond their purely rational and often limited perspective of life. Which is fantastic, really, because it's something that we can use too. Often our own vision, without realizing it, of life is a bit blinkered. Our ego tends to have a limited perspective of things. It's black or it's white, it's my way or the highway. We limit ourselves to what we know or what we think we know. This prospect of synchronicity helps us to open that, to widen that perspective a little bit, to open ourselves to the possibility of things that we don't know, that we can't explain, that perhaps we can understand, at least in relation to how it affects us, what we can learn from it. So he goes on to offer certain examples, the kind of experiences that we can have related to synchronicity. In his paper in 1952, he describes these different forms of synchronistic events that we can observe. One, he says, is the coincidence of a psychic state in the observer with a simultaneous objective external event that corresponds to the psychic state or content. So it's a technical way of saying an inner feeling or experience or state of mind that's reflected in something external and objective. The example being this lady in his example. She dreams about a scarab. She's talking about the content of her dream, and then the content of her dream appears externally. The second kind is the coincidence of a psychic state with the corresponding external event taking place outside the observer's field of perception. So some inner state which is reflecting something outside of our perception. Simple kind of example, you're thinking about somebody and then suddenly they call you. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. Something, maybe you're worried about someone for some unknown reason, and then you find out later something happened to them. So it's a kind of intuitive experience that you have of something that happens outside of your field of perception you couldn't have known about. These are examples that he gave of ways to understand the different kind of psychic phenomena that may occur. And in relation to synchronicity, he says, the term itself explains nothing. It simply formulates the occurrence of meaningful coincidences, which in themselves are chance happenings, but are so improbable that we must assume them to be based on some kind of principle. Okay, so this is to help us understand what Jung talked about with synchronicity. As I mentioned in the beginning, he doesn't make any direct reference to karma in relation to this principle of an acausal connective principle. But the way that he describes it has a lot of interesting correlations to the concept of karma as it is explained in Eastern tradition. And even the way Jung talks about synchronicity and causality, he talks about them as complementary. It's not mutually exclusive. They're supportive theories. Causality as in cause and effect, we can see action-reaction. We can observe that. Synchronicity then helps us to go beyond what we can observe to understand a little bit what we can't necessarily explain. So how does that relate to karma then as a concept? Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we often simplify karma as cause and effect, action, reaction. Again, it's not wrong, but let's go a little bit deeper in understanding what Eastern traditions talk about with the idea of karma. They also explain that we can understand karma as a compensatory mechanism in nature that's constantly seeking balance. It seeks balance by correcting the flow of life. And in doing so, there's so many facets of cause and effect, action, reaction, that are at play in an incredibly integrated and intelligent and complex manner that for us observing life, often it's difficult for us to ascertain exactly where the cause and effect is related. So to put it simply, when we look at life, it's difficult to make sense of sometimes because we get lost in where things started, how things happened. The ego wants to be able to see clearly that this led to that. But as we know from our own experiences, I'm sure, life is not that simple. So if I say that karma is a compensatory mechanism of nature, what does that mean? What ancient traditions talk about with karma is that it is a principle it's an expression of a principle or law called dharma. In Hinduism, they talk a lot about this idea of dharma as a path, as a trajectory of evolution, which is being regulated by cause and effect, karma. To use another example, in China, there's Tao, which is also this idea of a path, which then is expressed through yin and yang, active and receptive polarities that are complementary. So karma is comprised of active polarities, cause and effect, action, reaction, that are seeking balance. And everything in nature seeks balance or homeostasis. If we leave an environment alone, the ecosystem that develops regulates itself. But in life, there are actions. Our actions have impact, consequences. And so there's a need to redress, balance the impact of our actions. If we take the example of cycling in terms of movement and balance, cycling is a constant state of imbalance in motion. In order to stay balanced, we have to act. We have to keep moving. So if we're veering off course, then as we cycle, we naturally have to correct ourselves. But in life, often when we act, we're not conscious that we're veering off. So karma acts in a way as nature's effort to balance that, to help us to correct our course. The idea of action and reaction is something that we understand even scientifically with Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if I veer off, if I go towards an extreme, then the process of balancing that will have to create a reaction equal to the action, which can lead to us experiencing what we commonly call suffering. Because if I veer off, if I go away from my path, if I go to an extreme, then the consequence of my action is often some kind of difficulty. Excess generally leads to suffering. It's a kind of a Buddhist principle. Karma's function in nature then is to intelligently create that rebalance. It's not a blind mechanism doling out punishment. Rather, it's something that is intelligently seeking balance in all things. Sometimes I think it's a difficult concept for us in the West. We're heavily influenced by the kind of Judeo-Christian model, which is very based on punishment as a concept. So we feel that these things are punishment. I've done something wrong. It's my fault. But this is simply nature reestablishing balance, which does mean that we have to take responsibility for our actions. So cause and effect, again, is something we can understand simply, but it's not so simple. And why is that? Well, what they explain is that there are different kinds of karma. There's different elements to karma. They talk about three kinds of karma, first of all: individual, personal, and collective. Collective karma is the karma generated by two or more people. So any couple, any relationship, family, a village, a country, all generates its own karma, because every collectivity is going to act a certain way and produce consequences of those actions. What it simply suggests is that we're connected, that our actions impact others. Sometimes we may disconnect from that and think that, well, whatever, it doesn't matter what I do, nobody cares anyway. Or I'm not hurting anybody, it's just my life. But we're connected in an incredible network of humanity that our actions invariably impact others, even if we can't perceive it. So the collectivity produces its own karma. They also talk about personal karma. This is probably the more simple one to understand, our day-to-day karma, if you like. The more perceivable actions and reactions of our day-to-day behavior, which generates its own consequences, often more easy for us to perceive, depending, of course, on how conscious we are, how aware of ourselves and our behavior we are. Because if I'm not paying much attention, then I won't see the consequences of my actions. Then they talk about individual karma, explaining the concept of, we could say, long-term karma. As an Eastern principle, this is referring to the idea of reincarnation, that over the course of many lifetimes, we're accumulating karma. Reincarnation is a whole other subject we could get into, but without spending too much time on that, understanding the idea that human evolution is a lengthy process. And they suggest in the East that we are accumulating experience, lifetime after lifetime, to progressively improve and evolve from a consciousness point of view. And as we're building that experience, we're generating karma, lifetime after lifetime, which is starting to then direct the course of our various incarnations. So there's elements then of how we have forged our existence, our experiences to this point. Then there's the day-to-day karma of the personality, and then there's the collective karma of the environment that we're in. And then to add another layer of complexity, that personal day-to-day karma has different facets too, because there's physical karma. We generate an energetic karma, emotional karma, mental karma. The different actions that we have, the way that we think, the way that we feel, all produces consequences. And they have varying intensities. You know, the physical karma versus emotional karma, they can have different intensities, different lengths of time that they endure. Simple example I often use is, you know, if you get a slap across the face from someone that you love, what's going to have more impact, the smack or the emotional shock? So the karma of ideas then, mental karma, is even longer lasting, because we can see the power ideas have to survive generations. The ideas that we're talking about here are already thousands of years old in many cases. So taking all this into account, we can start to see that the idea of karma is not that simple. There's an incredible tapestry of cause and effect that's being woven in life. And that pattern can be so far-reaching that it can become impossible for us to concretely observe why something is happening. So how do we experience that then? Generally, as victims, we feel victimized. Why me? Why is the world out to get me? What did I do to deserve this? When we don't understand or we can't explain why things are happening, we tend to feel like we're being punished. But as Jung was explaining with synchronicity, when events are bringing things to our awareness, that's karma trying to correct, trying to bring balance. It's not punishing anyone. Something is being raised to our attention so that we can do something about it. Another way of looking at this is that things are being brought to our attention, things that need to happen for us to learn from them. Jung talks about the idea of individuation, that we become more whole and complete individuals. And that we do that through integrating into our consciousness, through experience, that which we do not know about ourselves, which he called the shadow, another very interesting subject. But namely, there is an aspect of ourselves that is unfamiliar, unknown. In reality, it's our own potential. And karma is bringing to our attention the things that we can face in order to face ourselves and awaken that potential. Even difficult things. Yes, because we need obstacles to overcome. We tend to judge those things as bad because it's difficult, so I don't like it. But new things, things that we don't do naturally or that we haven't done before, they're always going to be difficult in the beginning. If everything was easy, we'd have nothing to learn from in life. But then we sometimes think, well, does that mean that I deserve terrible things to happen to me? But it's not a question of deserving anything. That presupposes that there's some kind of judgment involved or that we're being punished. And it also makes a judgment on the thing itself being terrible, which is often relative, because it's our perception of things that makes us decide whether it's good or bad. Rather, we're being confronted by something, even difficult, that we need to learn from. And so karma is presenting an incredible opportunity for us to face something that will help us to develop, to evolve, to strengthen ourselves. Whether we can clearly see the cause behind it ultimately is irrelevant, or of relevant importance. Relative importance, whether we can see where it comes from. All that really matters is what I do with it now. Interestingly, the root of the word karma in Sanskrit, it's kr, and it means action. Otherwise, we can fall into this kind of fatalistic perception that, well, it's all predetermined. It's my past lives, or it's the collectivity, or it's, I can't determine my own fate in all of this. But what we can do always is determine how I act now, even if I can't understand why things are happening. Or to be Jungian about it, if I can't explain why things are happening, I can still understand it. I can understand what I need to do now. Because we always have a choice of how we act. To not be a victim and to simply do what we need to do. I'm a little conscious of time, so I think we're coming up to the end of the presentation here. I just want to conclude by summarizing what I think is the real application of these ideas, synchronicity and karma, to help us to perceive a little bit more intuitively, derive meaning and purpose a little bit from what's happening, to help us to not only feel victimized by life or that we're in any way enslaved to fate. Even if we can't explain it, we can understand what we need to do. And really the beauty for me in all of these theories is the assertion that nothing happens by chance. Everything in life has a meaning. Even if we can't explain it in terms of causality, cause and effect, there's a significance to things that we can reflect on, that we can discern, to help us to derive meaning even from the craziness of life, so that we can live a life of meaning, of purpose, and above all, we can act in accordance to that meaning.